Welcome, Bruchim Aba'im. I am Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi, and you have found Beit Virtuali. I'm going to let you all this week into a little secret, and that is that many rabbis already know exactly what they want to say for their weekly or 2 times a week sermons before they even begin looking at the texts of the week, which is one of the great benefits of having a tradition with so much depth and breadth to the textual tradition, is that we can pretty much find anything to say what we want it to say. And yes, that should frighten you just a little bit, but bear with me. I'm thinking about this because years ago, when I was serving at a lovely small community outside of Seattle, Washington, I got mad at something in the world. I have no idea what it was, and that's not even important, but I decided at the beginning of the week that I wanted to speak about righteous wrath. I wanted to explain through Torah and through Jewish legal tradition on when it was okay for us to get our pound of flesh and when it was not okay for us to get our pound of flesh. And so I dove into the text knowing I'd find something in the weekly parashah or in the Talmud or something, and I found, no, under no circumstances are you allowed to be wrathful. Surprise! We actually have in the collective consciousness the text that this comes from. It's actually from Christian tradition. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, which sounds very King James because that is King James. It's from the book of Romans, but it comes from the Torah. In the Torah, we actually read, Li nakam v'shilem, which means li, to me, nakam, wrath. So to me belongs wrath, or to me is the wrath, the and shilem, and recompense or repayment. So it's not just vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. It's actually, to me belongs all wrath and vengeance, as well as any concept of shilem, which is kind of the Jewish concept of karma. In other words, payback. So we don't get to do payback. We don't get to do revenge. And the entire verse is really interesting. The translation is, to me is vengeance and repayment at the time that their foot falters, at the day their disaster is near and destiny rushes upon them. When their foot falters, there's something even gentle about that, meaning that, much unlike many people view the quote-unquote God of the Old Testament, this is not about wrath. It's about when something really goes wrong, when we do something really stupid. Hold on, because someone else needs to deal with that, someone a heck of a lot wiser than we are. So wait a second, does that mean that I can never say that someone's done something wrong? And the answer is no. There's a difference between wrath and expecting that we are the instruments of someone's karmic comeuppance, and it's very different when we actually are required, or when we need to, or we think we need to, actually recognize that someone that we're close to is doing something wrong, and then deal with it. And this word in Judaism is called tochacha. It's translated as rebuke, and it comes from the tochacha, the rebuke, in the book of Leviticus, which is one of the 2 major series of curses and blessings. But the real core verse actually comes from the Holiness Code, from chapter 19 of Vayikra, of the book of Leviticus, where we actually get a pretty, well, kind of a bombshell ethical statement. Now, anytime I quote something from Talmud or Torah, just look down below for the links. You should be empowering yourself. You should be reading. You should be checking to make sure that what I say is what I say, that my translations of these texts are good. But the text from Vayikra 19:17, Leviticus 19:17 is, Hocheach tochiach et amitecha velo tisa alav chet. Now, I'm going to break that down for you a little bit here. But first of all, I'm going to make kind of more of a general point, the way that I want us to think about Jewish law, about halakha, and it's not a point that I think is always driven home. We usually think, what's the Jewish law or what's the halakha for something, and we think of, well, let's be honest, we think of the thing that our rabbi told us or that we read that one time. If we want to get more exact, it is the most common or normative decision that's been made by the most robustly listened to posek or authority on Jewish law, which is going to depend completely on who you are and where you are and who you believe is an authority. But it's more complicated than that, because this verse from Vayikra is, I want you to think of it like a big bang. And all primary verses for halakha, many of them come from Torah, are like a big bang. We have this core of incredibly densely packed stuff, and then it gets written down and it explodes out, and we spend the next 3,000 years in dialogue with that. And here's what halakha actually is. Halakha is, yes, the epitomization of that. to the extent that we can epitomize anything that comes from Torah, simultaneously the entire breadth of dialogue that occurs over time. Which is why if anyone says there is only one way to think of something, you need to run away from that rabbi as fast as is humanly possible, because they're ignoring the other part of halacha, which is the entire dialogue. But this particular verse starts off with hocheach tochiach. It's two different versions of rebuke or tochacha. And when you have two different words stuck together that are the same root, we call that, oh, you're going to love this, is the German term infinitus absolutus. I'm doing that just to show off because of my good German education here. But it means, usually we translate that as, you shall surely rebuke. You see this most commonly in tzedek tirdof. You shall surely pursue justice. We might talk about that a little bit later on. But it means that rebuking is an important thing. And that's part of why there's so much dialogue, because each individual word or set of words has so much discussion around it. What does it mean to surely rebuke? Does it mean that under all conditions I'm required to rebuke, or are there alternative possibilities, or are there exceptions to the rule? Well, that's the dialogue, because some rabbi is going to come out, or some Jewish leader or teacher is going to come out and say, what about in this situation? And that's what happens over the next thousands of years. So, hocheach tochiach, you must surely, absolutely, completely, you must rebuke whom? Et amitecha. At your Well, what's your It's usually translated as people. It can be your friend, can be your neighbor, and indeed different translations deal with that as a friend, a chaver, or a neighbor, as your ra'eh. But it's not your enemy, and it's not the stranger, which is the next part of this. Who are we allowed to rebuke? Well, according to the Torah, it's a pretty narrow group of people. We continue on. V'lo tisa alav chet. And in doing so, you do not take on sin yourself. Again, so much to unpack here. First of all, chet is a certain kind of sin, and I promise somewhere near, I promise before the High Holy Days. Can you believe what I just did there? Somewhere around the High Holy Days, bli neder, without promise, I hope to do a video on the different words for sin in Judaism and their different meanings. But it means that we rebuke lest otherwise we take that sin upon ourselves. And each of those ideas, how you can see that just one verse contains with it almost an infinite amount of possibility. Now, I'm going to jump ahead a couple thousand years, and the purpose of our dialogues and comments and questions to ask on the podcast is for all that in-between stuff. If there's something that you want to ask a question about, or the sources that are down below, or anything that I've skipped over, that's what the podcasts are for. That's what our dialogue is for. So make sure that you're leaving those questions so that we can discuss them on our first podcast coming up quickly. We're going to jump ahead to what I think is the best epitomization of the endpoints of these dialogues. And if you know me well, you are going to laugh, because I'm going to quote from the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Now, some people think Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, Kitzur means shortened or summarized, is a summary of the Shulchan Aruch, the magnum opus by Joseph Caro with a gloss from Moshe Isserles. I will talk about the Shulchan Aruch at some point in more detail and how it came to be. But it's not a shortened version of it, even though it seems like it is. It's its own work of halacha. It is a compact set of rules written by a guy named Shlomo Ganzfried from the 19th century. And the reason I usually don't like this is because he went through and he does not cite where a lot of these items come from. And even worse than that, he usually takes the absolute most stringent ruling possible. And I am profoundly against that interpretation of Judaism. Again, a discussion for a different day. But in this case, his chapter 29 contains within it rules of integrity. And within them, starting at around paragraph 15, he summarizes a lot of this discussion over time for how we should look at tochacha, or how we should look at rebuke. Now, again, you're going to find the link down below. I'm going to summarize it my own way because some of the items are pretty technical. There's a technical item, for example, on is this d'Rabbanan or d'Oraita? Does it come from the rabbis, from the Torah? Maimonides says it comes from the Torah. Good. There's also the question on, does this apply for a specific time or place? Really important. Like, we can't do temple sacrifice. Thank goodness, because we don't have a temple anymore. Its own discussion. And the answer is this is for all time, all place, for all Jews. I would say for all humans. This is a pretty universal series of rules. So I'm going to do my own summary of these, and I invite you to read them all for yourself. But here they are. We'll comment later. In the most simple form, number one is, if you see your friend, neighbor, your chaver, sinning, doing something that requires rebuke, you are required to rebuke them. Point number one. But, remember, nothing that comes before the but actually matters. 2, who, where, and how matter. Meaning, amitecha, we've already defined am is your neighbor or your friend, not the stranger. And 2, where? Privately. Number 3, how? Gently, and also required in this is that you explain why you're doing it and what benefit they gain from it. The way that the text is put together is you explain to them that in following this advice, you will have a place in ha'olam haba, in the world to come. We will talk about ha'olam haba, bli neder, also at some time there. Continuing on. 3, if you are in a position to rebuke someone and you do not, then the sin that you were able to stop falls upon you. It's as if you yourself did it. Just fascinating. But, again, only applies what comes after the but. This only applies if you have a reason to believe that you will be listened to. Deep breath on that one. Next, and if you know that you will not be listened to, you are forbidden to rebuke. Finally, 6, it is forbidden to humiliate or publicly shame someone. I'm going to read that one again. It is forbidden to humiliate or publicly shame someone. I do want to read just a little bit of the actual language that's in that part there. It is forbidden to humiliate anyone by word or deed, especially in public. And our rabbis of blessed memory said in the Babylonian Talmud in Baba Metzia 58b, a person who humiliates someone in public will have no share in the world to come. Our rabbis of blessed memory said furthermore, and this is where it gets nice and intense, it is better for a man to throw himself into a fiery furnace than to put their fellow to shame. Continuing on, therefore, you should be careful not to humiliate anyone in public, whether child or adult, nor to call anyone by a name for which they are ashamed. That's a video in and of itself. And do not relate in their presence anything to which they are ashamed. And if anyone sinned against you and it's necessary for you to admonish them, do not humiliate them. For it is said, do not sin through them. Also a quote from the book of Leviticus. This is a complete, utter, direct contradiction to the zeitgeist. This is not how we are functioning as human beings in a society. And yeah, here I'm saying this on YouTube. It's ironic. I get it. The problem is that we're having a hard time unpacking the difference between calling out behavior and shaming people. And there really are two different things to look at here because, yes, there is a powerful moment right now in the world to actually see injustices that never existed before and to actually become conscious of those in a way that we've never become conscious before. But we have to be able to separate that somehow from ripping down a human being who is doing that. Well, why? How? Well, you have to carry it through to its logical conclusion. We have to in some way try to universalize this, at least in this way. The end point of being conscious of behavior is that we become conscious of behavior and we find ways to teach each other and teach ourselves to not behave in those ways that are destructive. On the other hand, if we believe the way to do this is to destroy individuals, then you've universalized the ability for that to come around to you. And if anyone thinks that they are the one who has never done something worthy of rebuke, then we who believe that are exactly the problem. Put that a different way. If any of us believe that we belong to a specific group or a specific series of principles that makes us above and beyond any sort of rebuke, well, I invite us to look through all of world history and find any time where someone who believed that they could do no wrong, what happened to the society that they led. It's an especially brutal contradiction because right now the best way to get a lot of followers on YouTube is to find a person who's done something awful and publicly shame them. Yeah, but this is just a silly ancient religion with ancient words that mean not a whole lot to us anymore. Well, the challenge to that is this. Are we in dialogue with how we call people out? Have we really thought about it? Have we really thought about how we would receive the same sort of rebuke? there is a universal ethic, and I think it comes from what we call the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I've been in dialogue with that for a book that I'm working on right now, and I've seen critique against it because the way that someone in a different culture might wish to be treated is different than the way that I would want to be treated. So I want to quote the Jewish version of that. And yes, you can find some version of this universal ethic in every world culture, every world religion, and every world philosophy for the most part, and the exceptions are worthy of discussion in and of itself. But the Jewish version of this is that which is reprehensible to you, do not do to another. And when we think of public shaming and humiliation, do any of us want to be publicly shamed? I've been publicly shamed. It is horrific in a profound sort of way. And if you've never experienced it, you have no idea what I'm talking about. And I would recommend that we take a step back from this precipice as quickly as possible. But yes, it is an ancient religion, one that honestly shouldn't exist, but still does, partially because we keep on adding these dialogues over time, and we're allowed to gain wisdom and build wisdom over time. And right now in society, we've rejected a lot of this wisdom by creating an idea that it's okay to publicly shame and humiliate. And we've oftentimes added to that our wrath and our belief that it's our job to make karma happen immediately for someone. So, little food for thought, a little bit heavy for the second video on this channel. At the same time, that's exactly where we are. Thank you again for joining us. We've got a few videos coming up over the next few weeks. I want to give a profound word of thanks. We have a Patreon membership service. We have the first handful of members. Thank you all so very much. And our first pillar, Sam, we've got some videos coming up that are recommended by our Patreon. So next week will be a video on heaven and hell as they manifest through interpretation of Torah. Yes, you heard that right. Thank you, Jacob, for subscribing, being such a mensch, and I'm going to have a lot of fun making that video. In the meantime, like, subscribe, and share this video consciously and carefully, because if you're sharing to someone a video on Rebuke, right? As we share things like this, we say, this is something you might find interesting, not, this is something you need to hear. Let's be a little bit more gentle with each other. Let's treat each other a little bit better. And by doing so, let's lift all of us up at the same time. Take care, everyone. We'll see you next time.
בית ישראל, עמך אהבת. תורה ומצוות, חוקים, משפטים אותנו לימדת. תורה ומצוות, חוקים, משפטים